The first sign was not a roar, it was not fire falling from the sky, it was not a military alert or a breaking news chyron cutting across your morning coffee. The first sign was silence, a silence that had no right to exist in a world this loud, this filthy, this permanently switched on. For exactly 4 seconds, every screen in New York City went dark, every billboard, every phone, every Vought Tower display cycling through Homelander's smile. 4 seconds of black. And then, as if the universe had simply cleared its throat before saying something that could not be unsaid, they came back, and the world was already different. Because somewhere beneath the Atlantic Ocean, a small orange sphere with 4 stars had just begun to glow. Nobody knew what it meant yet. That was the beauty of it. That was the horror of it. It started the way all catastrophes do in the boys' universe, not with a declaration, but with a leak. A fishing trawler crew out of Nova Scotia posted 11 seconds of footage to a conspiracy forum at 3:47 in the morning. The object sat on the captain's deck. It was the size of a grapefruit. It pulsed like a slow heartbeat. It was warm to the touch, the caption said, even though the ocean temperature was near freezing. The post got 14 upvotes. Ahmad deleted it within an hour, but someone had already screenshotted it, and someone had already sent it to someone else. And by sunrise, the 14 upvotes had become 14 million impressions. Vought International's social media war room flagged it at 6:02 a.m. By 6:15, 3 senior analysts had briefed a vice president. By 6:30, the vice president had made a call that did not appear on any company record. The word acquisition was used. The word precedent was used. The word containment was used 6 times. Nobody used the word miracle. That word was reserved for branding. It would come later, polished and packaged and heat-sealed in patriotic colors. But in that conference room with the floor-to-ceiling glass and the perfect Manhattan skyline, what Vought saw was not wonder. What Vought saw was a market that had not yet been priced. Within 72 hours, 6 more objects had surfaced across the globe, one in rural Brazil, one off the coast of Japan, one half buried in the Siberian permafrost, glowing faintly orange beneath 6 feet of frozen earth. One reportedly found by a 12-year-old girl in rural Kansas who thought it was a toy and brought it home in her backpack. The global response moved exactly the way a contagion does, invisibly at first, then everywhere, then unstoppable. Governments activated protocols nobody wanted to name in public. Militaries began moving assets. Vought deployed 3 hero teams under a humanitarian aid framework and had them on planes before the press conference was even drafted. Nobody had summoned anything yet. Nobody had said the word dragon, but the world was already rearranging itself around 7 small spheres as though it had always been designed for exactly this kind of collapse. Because that is the truth about the boys' universe that nobody in it wants to admit out loud. It was never stable. It was always one spectacular event away from dropping the mask entirely. The soups were never heroes. They were leverage. The government was never protection. It was management. The public was never a community. It was a consumer base kept calm by entertainment, fear, and the carefully controlled illusion that someone powerful was on their side. And into all of that, with the weight of something ancient and entirely indifferent to corporate quarterly projections, Shenron arrived. Not with theatrics, not with a press release. The sky above Sao Paulo simply split open on the 6th day like a wound that had been waiting to be made, and an emerald light poured down from a darkness that had no business existing at noon. The crowds below did not run. They froze. Because what emerged from that light was not a weapon. It was not a soup. It was not a Vought product. It was something so undeniably, impossibly real that even the most media-saturated, spectacle-immune, permanently cynical population on Earth could not process it through their usual filters of irony and distrust. The dragon had no interest in being believed. That was the first thing that separated him from everything else in that world. Homelander needed the cameras. The 7 needed the ratings. Vought needed the narrative. Shenron needed nothing. He simply existed, emerald and vast and ancient, hanging above a city of 20 million people who had spent their entire lives being lied to by things that called themselves gods. And for one breathless, terrible, perfect moment, the lying stopped. The world looked up. and the world understood that something had entered this universe that was not for sale. It would not stay that way for long. If you want to see what happens when the most corrupt civilization on Earth is handed one real miracle, subscribe now. Because in the boys' universe, the question was never whether humanity deserved a dragon. The question was how many bodies it would stack beneath him before the first wish was made. And the answer, as you are about to discover, is enough to make even a wish feel like a threat. To understand why Shenron's arrival was not a salvation but a detonation, you first have to understand the universe he fell into. Because the boys' universe is not simply a dark version of our world. It is something more specific and more sinister than that. It is a world that took every broken instinct humanity has ever had. The hunger for power, the addiction to spectacle, the willingness to sell belief to the highest bidder, and built an entire civilization around them. A civilization that looks from the outside like a democracy with good special effects. But underneath the Vought towers and the hero merchandise and the patriotic anthems, it is something far older and far uglier. It is a world designed from the ground up to manufacture false gods and then profit from the worship. Vought International did not start as a weapons company or a pharmaceutical giant, though it became both. It started as something more dangerous, a storytelling machine, a factory for myth. The genius of Vought was never Compound Phi. Compound 5 was the mechanism. The genius was understanding that human beings do not simply want protection. They want to believe that something greater than them is watching over them, and they will pay almost anything to maintain that belief. In ticket sales, in merchandise, in political loyalty, in silence. Vought gave the world superheroes not because it cared about crime or war or justice, but because it understood that a population with a god to worship is a population that can be managed, and managed populations are profitable populations. The Seven were the crown jewel of that system. The most powerful, the most visible, the most ruthlessly brand-managed group of superpowered individuals on the planet. Homelander was not a hero. He was an asset so perfectly constructed that even the people running him sometimes forgot he was not real. He had been engineered in a laboratory, raised in isolation, conditioned to crave approval, and then pointed at the public like a loaded gun dressed in a flag. The public loved him with the desperate, unconditional love that people give to things they need to be true. And Homelander, beneath the smile and the cape and the laser-precise understanding of what the cameras wanted, was something far more terrifying than any villain Vought had ever marketed against. He was a man with the power of a god and the emotional architecture of an abandoned child, and he had never, not once, encountered anything in his world that he could not eventually break, buy, or burn. Then there was Billy Butcher. If Homelander was the system's perfect product, Butcher was the system's perfect wound. A man built from grief and fury and a hate so clean and pure it had long since stopped needing justification. Butcher did not want to reform the world. He did not want to negotiate with it or improve it or find a reasonable middle ground. He wanted to tear out the part of it that had taken everything from him, and he had spent years becoming exactly the kind of weapon that could do it. He was brilliant, brutal, and utterly incapable of imagining a version of victory that did not involve someone suffering for what had been done. In another universe, he might have been a soldier. In another universe, he might have been a saint. In this one, he was the most dangerous man alive who could still technically die from a headshot. Starlight, Annie. January occupied the cruelest position of all. She had entered the system believing the myth was real. She had wanted to be a hero in the way that children want it, with the whole weight of childhood sincerity behind the wanting, and the system had taken that sincerity and used it like a currency, spending it slowly, extraction by extraction, until she was left standing in the middle of Vought Tower, understanding exactly what she had signed up for and unable to leave without destroying everything she had built. Her importance in a world suddenly confronted with Shenron was this. She was the only major figure who might look at a genuine miracle and ask, before reaching for it, whether reaching was right. The public, though, the millions of ordinary people crushed between these enormous forces, they are the part of this equation that matters most and is discussed least. Because in the boys' universe, civilians are not background, They are the point. They are the ones fed the myths, sold the merchandise, sent to die in wars justified by hero narratives, and left to grieve in private when the system fails them. They are the ones whose children are born with compound 5 in their blood because a corporation decided the profit margin justified the experiment. They are the ones who wake up every morning in a world that has superheroes and is still somehow perfectly designed to make ordinary people feel powerless. Into this world, into this specific, intentional, engineered powerlessness, fell 7 Dragon Balls. And the moment they arrived, something happened that Vought had never planned for, and every government had never wargamed, and every soup had never once considered. Ordinary people understood immediately what the Dragon Balls meant, not because they had studied Dragon Ball lore, but because every human being on Earth, no matter how beaten down, no matter how thoroughly the system has convinced them that hope is a product sold back to them at a markup, every human being carries somewhere in them the knowledge of what they would wish for if wishing were real. The sick father, the dead child, the life never lived, the world that should have been. That knowledge, dormant and unspoken in a world built to keep it quiet, detonated the moment Shenron's existence became undeniable. And the explosion was not wonder. It was not gratitude. It was something far more volatile, far more human, and far more dangerous in a world already running on corruption and fumes. It was need. Raw, desperate, uncontrollable human need, crashing against a system that had spent decades learning to monetize everything except the truth. Shenron had not even spoken yet. He had not granted a single wish, and already the world was beginning to fracture along every fault line it had spent years pretending did not exist. Because in the boy's universe, the arrival of something genuinely divine does not inspire the best in people. It simply removes the last excuse for hiding the worst. The first government to officially deny the existence of the Dragon Balls was the United States. The second was China. The third was Russia. All 3 denials were issued within the same 6-hour window, which told anyone paying attention everything they needed to know, because governments do not coordinate denials about things that do not exist. They coordinate denials about things they are already racing each other to possess. The official statements used careful language, words like unverified phenomena and potential security concern and ongoing assessment. What they did not use was the word impossible. Because by the time those statements were drafted, classified intelligence from 3 separate agencies had already confirmed what the fishing trawler footage had suggested. The objects were real, they were warm, they were indestructible by any conventional means tested, and at least 2 of them had already disappeared from government custody under circumstances nobody was willing to put in writing. Vought moved faster than any government. That was not a surprise. Vought had spent decades building infrastructure that governments only dreamed about. Private intelligence networks, hero deployment chains, media controls, mechanisms, and a legal apparatus so layered and so well funded that it could redefine the meaning of words in real time if the quarterly projections demanded it. Within 4 days of the Sao Paulo summoning, Vought had rebranded its entire hero deployment division under a new initiative called Global Assurance. The press release described it as a proactive humanitarian response to emerging global phenomena. The internal memo described it as the single greatest acquisition opportunity in company history. 3 hero teams were already in the field. 2 more were being briefed. The mission parameters, classified at the highest internal level, were simple. Find them, secure them, and under no circumstances allow any non-Vought entity to complete the set. Homelander learned about the Dragon Balls the same way he learned about everything he was not supposed to know. By listening through walls he was not supposed to be able to hear through, in rooms he was not supposed to enter, to conversations people believed were private. He stood in the hallway outside the Global Assurance briefing room for exactly 41 seconds, long enough to hear the words wish-granting, 7 spheres, and effectively omnipotent entity. Then he walked away. He did not immediately react. He did not laser through the wall or demand to be briefed. He simply walked to the roof of Vought Tower, stood above the city, and was very quiet for a very long time. Which was, as anyone who had ever studied Homelander's psychology could tell you, always the most dangerous version of him. The loud Homelander was frightening. The quiet Homelander was catastrophic. What was happening inside him in those minutes was not simple jealousy. It was something older and more architectural than that. Homelander had built his entire identity on a single foundational belief, that he was the most powerful thing in the world, and that this power entitled him to everything. Love, obedience, worship, existence itself on his own terms. That belief was not arrogance. It was the only load-bearing wall in a psychological structure that had been constructed by trauma, isolation, and decades of deliberate manipulation. Remove that wall, and there was nothing underneath. No self, no center, just the raw, howling need that Vought had created and then pointed outward at a world too frightened to look directly at it. A wish-granting dragon did not merely challenge Homelander. It threatened to reveal, to him and to everyone watching, that the most powerful man alive had always been exactly as fragile as his worst moments suggested. Butcher heard about it differently. He heard about it from a source inside the CIA so deep that the source's own handler did not know the source existed, delivered in a text message that contained no words, only coordinates and a timestamp and a single emoji that they had agreed 2 years earlier would mean, something has changed that changes everything. Butcher sat in his car outside a kebab shop in South London for 20 minutes reading those coordinates. He was not a man who wasted time on wonder. He was not built for awe or spectacle or the kind of philosophical pause that a genuine miracle might reasonably demand. But he sat there for 20 minutes. Because even Billy Butcher, who had long since surgically removed every soft thing from his interior life, understood what 7 Dragon Balls meant in a world that contained Homelander. It meant that the endgame he had always known was coming had finally, irrevocably, arrived. The civilians suffered first, as they always do. Cities where Dragon Balls had been sighted went into unofficial lockdown within hours. Not government lockdowns, which come with paperwork and legal frameworks, but the organic, terrifying lockdown of a neighborhood that suddenly has military vehicles on every corner and helicopters overhead and men in tactical gear who do not display badges and do not answer questions. People disappeared, not in dramatic ways, not with public arrests or official announcements. They simply stopped being reachable. A man in Brasilia who had uploaded Dragon Ball footage went silent mid-thread. A woman in Hokkaido who had publicly claimed to have touched one of the spheres did not appear for her next shift at work and was never formally reported missing because no official agency acknowledged any reason for her to have gone missing. The cults formed with a speed that should have been surprising but was not, given the universe. Because the boys' world had always run on the gap between what people were promised and what they actually received, and that gap had never been wider or more painful than the moment genuine miracles became possible. Within 2 weeks of Shenron's first appearance, at least 40 separate groups had organized around Dragon Ball theology. Some of them believed the spheres were divine tests, some believed Shenron was an angel. Some believed the whole phenomenon was a Vought hoax designed to manufacture a new religion, and therefore a new revenue stream, which was, in pure structural terms, not an entirely unreasonable theory given Vought's documented history. But the most dangerous cults were not the ones built around theology. The most dangerous ones were built around something far more combustible. The belief that they, specifically, deserved the wish. That they had suffered enough. That the universe owed the me. By the end of the 3rd week, 6 of the 7 Dragon Balls had been located. Vought possessed 2. A Black Ops unit operating under no official government flag possessed 1. A cartel in northern Mexico, which had moved faster and more ruthlessly than any legitimate institution, possessed 1. 1 remained in the hands of the 12-year-old girl from Kansas, whose parents had barricaded their farmhouse and whose father had reportedly told the 3 separate armed groups that came to their door the same thing each time, that his daughter had found it, that it was hers, and that he had a rifle and a property line and a very clear understanding of both. And the 7th, the final sphere, the one that would complete the set and make the summoning not just possible but inevitable, had not yet been found. Every faction on Earth knew it was out there. Every faction on Earth was moving toward it, and somewhere above the clouds, patient and vast and entirely unconcerned with the frenzy being conducted in his name, the dragon waited. Vought's internal research division had a unit that most people inside the company did not know existed. It had no official name on any org chart. It was referred to in the handful of documents that acknowledged it at all simply as the Narrative Architecture Group. Its function was not to create heroes or manage soups or develop compound phi derivatives. Its function was to look at the world. At every cultural shift, every public panic, every emerging belief system, every social fracture, and ask one question: how do we sell this? They had done it with terrorism. They had done it with war. They had done it with the opioid crisis and the climate emergency and every mass tragedy that the modern media cycle had ground through its teeth and spat out as content. But the Dragon Balls presented them with something they had genuinely never encountered before. Not a crisis to be managed, an actual miracle to be monetized, and they attacked it with the focused creative hunger of people who had been waiting their entire careers for exactly this moment. The first campaign launched on a Tuesday. It was called Assurance. Clean white logo. Sans serif font. A soft orchestral score that split the difference between a pharmaceutical ad and a church hymn. The visual language was deliberate. No soups in costume, no explosions, no overt heroism. Just careful hands, institutional hallways, concerned but competent faces, and the quiet suggestion that very serious, very qualified people were handling something very important on your behalf. The tagline was 4 words: protecting the world's future. It ran simultaneously on 43 cable networks, across Vought's owned social infrastructure, and through a network of third-party news partnerships that were not disclosed as partnerships in any of the accompanying content. Within 6 hours, it had been viewed 200 million times. Within 12 hours, it had been analyzed, parodied, praised, and condemned in roughly equal measure. Within 24 hours, it did not matter what anyone thought of it because it had already done its primary job. It had established Vought as the legitimate authority on the Dragon Ball situation before any government had managed to say anything coherent. The merchandising followed within 48 hours, because of course it did. Dragon Ball replicas, officially licensed, legally distinct from the real objects, stamped with the Vought Assurance logo, were available for pre-order on the Vought store within 2 days of the campaign launch. They sold out in 11 minutes. A waiting list of 4 million people formed before the product page even properly loaded. The absurdity of it, the sheer, breathtaking audacity of selling plastic replicas of objects that could theoretically grant any wish to a population desperately hoping to have one wish granted, was not lost on anyone. It was discussed on every platform, dissected by every commentator, mocked by every late-night host who still had a show. None of that mattered, because mockery and merchandise are not opposites in the attention economy. They are the same transaction conducted in different emotional registers. Every person who bought one to be ironic had still bought one. Every person who shared a meme about how obscene it was had still shared the image of the product. Vought had learned this lesson years ago. In a media environment this saturated, the only thing worse than being talked about wrong is not being talked about. The religious fracture, when it came, was not one clean break. It was a shattering. Dozens of simultaneous cracks running through every major faith tradition on Earth because the Dragon Balls did not respect denominational boundaries. They were real. That was the problem. Every religion on Earth had built its theology, to varying degrees, on the premise that the miraculous was a matter of faith, that you believed in the divine without empirical confirmation, and that this belief was itself the point. The Dragon Balls broke that premise simply by existing. Because here was something undeniably, photographically, physically real, that operated on rules no existing theology had anticipated. Was Shenron divine? Was he demonic? Was he a test? Was he a gift? Was the correct response worship or fear or destruction? Every faith community on Earth fractured along the fault line of that question, and the fractures were not quiet. They were loud, political, occasionally violent, and almost universally exploited by someone with a financial interest in the outcome. The Seven did not fracture quietly either. The internal collapse of the world's most famous superhero team during the Dragon Ball crisis was, in retrospect, entirely predictable, because the Seven had never been a team in any meaningful sense. They were a brand. a collection of individually motivated, mutually suspicious, differently traumatized individuals held together by contract, by fear of Homelander, and by the shared understanding that the alternative to performing unity was worse than performing it. The Dragon Balls removed that calculus, because suddenly every member of the Seven was doing private math, calculating what a wish could give them, calculating what it would cost them if Homelander got there first, calculating whether this was finally the moment to run, or finally the moment to fight, or finally the moment to simply take what they had always wanted and let the consequences sort themselves out afterward. The Deep wanted gills that worked in fresh water. This was not a joke. This was a man so comprehensively broken by a decade of humiliation and the specific, grinding misery of being the least respected member of the world's most powerful team that when genuine miracle access became possible, his first instinct was not world peace or personal reinvention or revenge. It was gills that worked in fresh water, because he had spent so long in pain about such a specific thing that it had become the whole architecture of his wanting. A-Train wanted his heart fixed. Not metaphorically, not spiritually, but literally, physically. The cardiac damage that Compound 5 had done, reversed. He wanted to run again the way he had run before he started dying by increments on a track that kept demanding more than his body had left to give. Queen Maeve, if she were still present, would have wanted something nobody else on the team would have predicted. She would have wanted out, not death, not victory, just out. A world where she had never been inside any of this, where she was nobody, where the cameras had never found her. Huey Campbell's crisis was quieter than Butcher's and more destabilizing because of it. Butcher knew exactly who he was and exactly what he wanted and was simply deciding whether Shenron was the cleanest path to getting it. Huey did not have that clarity. Huey had spent the entirety of his involvement with the boys oscillating between the person he had been before Robin died and the person the fight had required him to become, and those two versions of himself had never fully reconciled. The Dragon Balls forced the question he had been avoiding. If you could wish away all the soups, wish away Compound 5, wish the whole superhuman apparatus out of existence, would the world be better? And the part that kept him awake was not whether the answer was yes. It was that he was not sure whether he trusted himself or Butcher or anyone to make that call cleanly, because every time he tried to imagine the world without soups, he ended up imagining Homelander still in it, wish or no wish, and the math stopped working. Frenchie and Kimiko moved through the chaos the way they always moved through the chaos. Not above it, not protected from it, but inside it, at street level. In the parts of the crisis that the cameras never found because they were not spectacular enough. They saw the families, the sick children whose parents had formed prayer circles around Dragon Ball sighting locations, the veterans who believed, with a specificity that was heartbreaking, that Shenron could reverse particular injuries sustained on particular days, in particular places that no official record acknowledged. The grieving mothers, the dying men, the people for whom the Dragon Balls were not a geopolitical crisis, or a corporate opportunity, or a theological puzzle. They were simply the first real reason to get out of bed since the worst day of their lives. And watching all of that, Kimiko, who could not speak but had never needed words to communicate devastation, made a gesture to Frenchie that he understood immediately. She was not asking whether Shenron was dangerous. She was asking whether any of the people chasing him deserved to win. The answer, neither of them said aloud, was already obvious. But obvious had never stopped this world before. And as the final Dragon Ball signal flickered to life somewhere in the Nevada desert, still warm, still pulsing, still entirely indifferent to everything being done in its name, the world stopped pretending it was going to handle this with anything resembling grace. The Nevada desert had never been a neutral place. It was a landscape built by geological violence and maintained by human secrecy, a place where the American government had tested nuclear weapons and buried inconvenient truths and constructed facilities that did not appear on any public map. It was a place that had absorbed an extraordinary quantity of the nation's darkest decisions and reflected none of them back. So there was a grim appropriateness to the fact that the seventh Dragon Ball surfaced there, in the dry basin of a dead lake 40 miles from the nearest paved road, glowing orange in the pre-dawn dark, like an ember that had been waiting underground for exactly this moment. 3 separate factions reached the location within the same 4-hour window. None of them knew the others were coming. All of them were heavily armed. And all of them had, in the hours before they arrived, made a private decision about what they were willing to do to leave with all 7 spheres. Vought arrived first. Technically, 2 black helicopters, no markings, 8 operatives in tactical gear that cost more per unit than most people earned in a year, and 1 member of the 7 who had been chosen for this operation not because of loyalty or moral fitness, but because of raw, deployable power and a contractual clause that gave Vought legal authority over their physical location at all times. They extracted the 7th sphere from the basin floor using equipment that had been designed for this specific object shape, which told anyone paying attention that Vought had known this moment was coming long before they had publicly acknowledged the Dragon Balls existed. The sphere was sealed in a containment case. The helicopters began to lift, and then the downdraft from a 3rd aircraft, much larger, much louder, bearing no markings of any kind, forced them back down. Butcher had arrived, and Butcher, unlike Vought, had not come with lawyers. The confrontation that followed in that basin was not the cinematic clash that the world's media, had it known where to point its cameras, would have constructed from it. It was not clean. It was not heroic. It was a brutal, low-light, close-quarters negotiation conducted in the language of people who had stopped believing words accomplished anything. Butcher's team had 2 things Vaught's operatives did not: the element of partial surprise and the specific, focused motivation of people who had nothing left to protect. They secured 3 of the 7 spheres in the first 6 minutes. Then Homelander arrived. He did not use a helicopter. He did not need one. He simply descended from the dark sky above the basin like a verdict, red cape catching the first gray light of dawn, and everything stopped. The shooting stopped. The shouting stopped. Even the desert wind seemed to make a decision about its volume, because whatever else Homelander was, he was still the most powerful physical force on Earth, and his arrival in a confined space had a gravitational quality that overrode every other calculation. He did not speak immediately. He looked at the scene below him, the bodies, the equipment, the spheres scattered across the basin floor, Butcher standing with 3 of them at his feet. And he processed it with the particular stillness that his worst moments always began with. Then he spoke, not loudly. Loudly would have been almost reassuring because loudness from Homelander had a known shape. This was quiet. This was the register he used when the performance had stopped and only the thing underneath it remained. He said, "Put them down." 2 words, addressed to Butcher specifically, not as an order to a subordinate, but as a statement of physics. The way you would tell someone standing too close to a cliff edge to step back, not out of concern for them, but out of a preference for a world in which the next few seconds unfold in a specific direction. Butcher did not put them down. Of course he did not. This was always going to be the moment. The 2 of them, finally, with something between them that was worth more than anything either of them had ever fought over, and nowhere left to perform reasonable behavior for an audience. Butcher looked at Homelander the way he had always looked at Homelander, with a hatred so refined by years of maintenance that it had become almost architectural, the foundational material of his entire remaining self, and said, "You're not getting all 7. Which was not a negotiating position. It was a declaration of what he was willing to die for. And Homelander, who had spent his entire life surrounded by people pretending not to be afraid of him, recognized in Butcher's face something he almost never encountered. A man who had made his peace with the outcome and was therefore immune to this primary weapon in Homelander's arsenal. The summoning happened because neither of them could stop it. Because while they faced each other across that basin floor, 2 colossal, irreconcilable forces locked in the specific paralysis that only occurs between people who hate each other too much to move first. Someone else acted. Someone neither of them had adequately accounted for. Starlight had been in the basin for 11 minutes before Homelander landed. She had come alone. She had not told Huey. She had not told anyone on the boys. She had followed the 7th Dragon Ball's location not through intelligence channels or satellite tracking, but through a source she had cultivated over months inside Vaught's narrative architecture group. A source who had contacted her not out of altruism, but out of the specific, corrosive guilt of a person who had spent too long monetizing other people's suffering and had finally found the line they could not cross. She had all 7 spheres arranged in the correct formation before the first shot was fired in the Vought-Butcher confrontation. She had been waiting, very still, in the shadow of a rock formation 30 meters from the basin floor, waiting for the moment when both sides were looking at each other instead of at her. The sky broke open the way it had in Sao Paulo, but different, because Sao Paulo had been the world's first introduction to something impossible. This was the world's second, and second encounters with the impossible do not produce wonder. They produce a particular species of dread that has no clean name, the feeling of a door being opened that you suddenly understand has no handle on the inside. The emerald light was wrong at that hour of the morning, in that landscape, against that sky. It violated the physics of the place so completely that the human brain could not settle on a response and simply stopped trying. Homelander looked up. Butcher looked up. Every operative in that basin looked up, and from the impossible crack in the Nevada sky, with a weight that pressed against the chest like the first note of something that had always been true, Shenron descended. His scales caught the dawn and turned it green. His eyes, each one larger than a vehicle, found the basin below with the calm, comprehensive attention of something that had witnessed the entire history of human need and had long since stopped being surprised by it. He did not speak yet. He simply looked. And in the silence before the wish, in that suspended and terrible moment when everything was still possible and nothing had yet been ruined, a thought moved through every human being in that basin simultaneously. Through Homelander and Butcher and Starlight and the Vought operatives and Butcher's team and somewhere, through the broadcast feeds being watched by millions of people who had found the signal and refused to look away. The thought was this: whoever speaks first will define what this world is, not what it was, not what it could have been, what it actually, fundamentally, irreducibly is. When given one moment of genuine power and no excuse left for what it chooses. And in the half-second before that silence ended, every person watching understood, with a certainty that sat in the stomach like cold stone, that they already knew the answer, that they had always known, that the boys' universe had been answering that question every single day of its existence, in every transaction and every lie and every body that the system had produced and discarded. The dragon was simply asking it out loud. Homelander spoke first. Nobody who had been paying attention was surprised. The surprise, the thing that landed in the chest like a stone dropped from height, was what he said. Because everyone in that basin had constructed in the seconds before he opened his mouth their own private prediction of what the most powerful and most broken man on Earth would demand from an ancient wish-granting dragon. Power, invulnerability, worship. The erasure of every person who had ever looked at him with anything less than total adoration. The obliteration of every limitation, every threat, every remaining uncertainty in a life that had been one long war against the possibility of being ordinary. What nobody predicted, what Homelander himself had not predicted until the words were already leaving him, was that he would ask for love, not compliance, not worship, not the performance of devotion that he had spent his entire life extracting from a terrified public. Love, real love, the kind he had never received. The kind he did not have the psychological vocabulary to describe except by its absence, which was the shape his entire life had taken around the hole where it should have been. Shenron did not answer immediately. The dragon's silence after Homelander spoke had a texture to it, not the silence of consideration or of language being translated, but something older. The silence of a force that has heard every version of this wish across every version of this moment in every civilization that has ever reached for him, and has learned to wait until the human being making the request understands what they are actually asking for. Homelander stood in the green light of the dragon's gaze and felt, for the first time in his life, genuinely seen, not observed, not monitored, not assessed for threat level or asset value or brand alignment. Seen, and the experience of being genuinely, scene, for a man who had spent 40 years performing existence rather than living it, was so catastrophically unfamiliar that it cracked something in him that the entirety of the boy's operations, Butcher's hatred, Starlight's moral challenges, and his own worst moments had never managed to reach. He began, very quietly, to come apart. Butcher moved in that moment, not toward Homelander, that would have been suicide even now, but toward Starlight, because Butcher had done the math in the seconds available to him with the speed and cold precision of a man who had spent years converting grief into tactical clarity, and the math said one thing. If Homelander was genuinely distracted, genuinely destabilized, genuinely occupied by something that had nothing to do with Butcher, or any of them, then this was the only window that had ever existed or would ever exist. He crossed the basin floor in 11 seconds. He reached Starlight. He did not touch her. He stood beside her and looked up at the dragon and said, in a voice stripped of everything except the essential, no performance, no bravado, no layer of Butcher that was not simply and exactly what he was, "I need the wish. You know what I'd do with it." And Starlight, who had been standing with her fists at her sides and her jaw set in the particular expression of someone holding a position they have decided to hold regardless of the cost, said, "That's why you're not getting it." The argument that followed between them lasted 43 seconds. It will not be reproduced here in full because its content was not the point. The content was the usual content: Butcher's case for annihilation, Starlight's case against, the specific moral mathematics of whether it was justified to erase an entire category of human being to protect the rest of humanity from what that category had been deliberately made into. They had had versions of this argument before. They would have had it again, in another world, on another day, with time to be subtle about it and space to be complicated. They did not have time or space here. What they had was 43 seconds and a dragon waiting and Homelander 20 meters away having the first genuine emotional crisis of his life. What they had was the entire history of a broken world condensed into a single choice that neither of them had been elected or appointed or in any way authorized to make on behalf of 8 billion people who were not in that basin and had not been asked. Starlight made the wish. The specific content of it had taken shape in her mind, not in that basin, not in the weeks of chaos that preceded it, but years earlier, in a quiet moment of clarity that had arrived, the way real clarity always does, sideways and unexpectedly, in the middle of something mundane. She had been sitting in her dressing room in Vought Tower after a press event, removing stage makeup, watching her own reflection with the detached analytical attention of someone who has learned to look at themselves the way a mechanic looks at an engine. And she had thought, if I could change one thing about this world, it would not be the soups. It would be the system that made them weaponizable. So that was the wish. Not the erasure of superpowers, not the death of any individual, not the reversal of any specific tragedy. The wish was for Compound 5. Every dose, every formula, every documented and undocumented derivative, every stored sample, every production capability on Earth, to be rendered permanently, irreversibly inert, not destroyed. Inert. Existing soups would remain as they were, but no new ones could be manufactured. No new Homelanders could be built in laboratories by corporations that had discovered that gods, properly managed, were more profitable than weapons. Shenron granted it. There was no spectacle to the granting, no explosion, no wave of energy, no visible transformation of the world. The sky simply closed. The green light withdrew. The dragon was gone between one breath and the next, with the same indifference to human witness that he had always carried. The Dragon Balls did not scatter immediately. They sat in their formation on the basin floor for exactly 4 seconds, long enough for every person present to look at them and understand that they were already becoming stone, gray and cooling and ordinary. Because Shenron's rules had always been the same, in every universe. Once the wish is granted, the magic returns to wherever magic goes when it is not being needed. The spheres would turn to stone and scatter to the winds and sleep for a year before they could be gathered again. And in that sleeping year, the world would have to decide what it actually was without the possibility of a do-over. Homelander had not heard the wish. He had been somewhere else entirely during the 43 seconds of argument. somewhere interior and devastated and entirely unlike the places he usually went when he was in crisis. When the green light withdrew and he returned to full awareness of the basin and the bodies and the stone spheres and Butcher and Starlight standing 20 meters away, he understood immediately that something had been granted without him. The expression that moved across his face in the seconds after that understanding arrived was not rage. It was something far more destabilizing to witness, because it was something he almost never allowed to be visible. It was grief. Raw, structureless, objectless grief. The grief of a man who had spent his entire life one step away from the thing he needed most, and had now watched it happen for someone else while he was too busy falling apart to stop it. Then the grief collapsed back into its usual architecture. The jaw set, the eyes went flat. The performance resumed, and everyone in that basin understood, with the specific dread that comes from watching something inevitable arrange itself, that whatever had cracked open in Homelander during those 43 seconds had not been resolved by Starlight's wish. It had only been deferred. The world would not know the details of what happened in that Nevada basin for 17 days. When the story broke, through a source inside Butcher's network who had recorded everything on equipment designed to survive Homelander's signal jamming radius, it broke all at once, fully formed in a data dump that hit every major platform simultaneously and could not be taken down before 100 million people had already seen it. The footage showed everything: the convergence, the confrontation, Homelander asking for love, Starlight making the wish, the dragon's departure. And in the aftermath of that footage, in the days and weeks of analysis and debate and accusation and counter-accusation that followed, the question that would not leave, that returned in every conversation and every comment section and every late-night argument in every language on Earth, was not whether Starlight had been right. It was something simpler and more corrosive than that. It was, if Shenron had granted Homelander's wish instead, if the dragon had given the most powerful man on Earth what he asked for, real and genuine and unconditional love, would any of the rest of it still have happened? Nobody could answer it. Nobody would ever be able to answer it. But the fact that the question existed, the fact that it was impossible to dismiss, that it sat in the chest and refused to dissolve, said something about the universe that Shenron had visited, something that no amount of analysis or debate or subsay, Quent history could quite put back in its container. The world did not feel different the morning after the wish. That was the first thing everyone noticed, and the first thing nobody knew how to process. People woke up expecting transformation, expecting the air to taste cleaner or the light to sit differently on familiar surfaces or some atmospheric signal that the universe had been altered at its foundations. They woke up expecting to feel the change the way you feel a weather shift, in the pressure behind the eyes and the particular quality of silence before rain. Instead, they woke up to the same news cycle, the same traffic, the same fluorescent office lights and cold coffee and accumulated weight of a world that had been broken long before a dragon appeared above it and would remain broken in most of the same ways now that the dragon was gone. The wish had not healed anything. It had only closed one specific wound while leaving the rest of the body exactly as it had always been: injured, exhausted, and entirely responsible for its own continued existence. Vought's response to the wish was a masterpiece of institutional adaptation, which is to say it was grotesque and impressive in equal measure and entirely predictable to anyone who had studied the company for more than 5 minutes. They had lost. In the narrow, specific, factual sense, they had not controlled the summoning. They had not made the wish. They had not acquired the asset they had deployed an entire parallel intelligence apparatus to secure. By any conventional measurement of corporate competition, they had failed completely. But Vought had not survived decades of public scandal, congressional investigation, and the ongoing operational hazard of managing people who could level city blocks by being inconvenienced, by accepting conventional measurements. Within 36 hours of the basin footage going public, Vought's narrative architecture group had produced a new campaign. It was called Legacy. It reframed the compound V inertization, not as a defeat, but as an evolution. The tagline was, "A new era of heroism." The message, delivered with the sincerity of people who had been practicing sincerity so long it had become indistinguishable from the real thing, was that Vought had always believed that true heroism was about the individual, not the formula. That the heroes who remained were proof that greatness was inherent, not manufactured. That this was, in fact, the future Vought had always been working toward. The existing soups processed the wish according to their individual architectures of need and fear, which is to say they processed it badly, in different directions, for different reasons, with outcomes that ranged from quietly devastating to immediately dangerous. A-Train's response was rage, not at Starlight specifically, but at the specific quality of being once again the person who the important decisions happened to rather than the person who made them. His heart was still damaged. His speed was still killing him by increments. The wish had changed nothing about his situation and had done it without consulting him, which was simply the latest iteration of a pattern that had defined his entire career. Being used, being spent, being left with the consequences of other people's choices, while the people who made the choices moved on to their next narrative. The Deep's response was quieter and more bewildering. He had wanted gills that worked in fresh water. He had not gotten gills that worked in fresh water. He sat on a beach in Malibu for 3 days, speaking to the ocean with the specific conversational register he used with marine animals, and the ocean said what the ocean always said, which was nothing that Mo translated cleanly into human language but was, by his account, sufficient. Homelander disappeared for 11 days, not officially. Officially, there were press releases and spokesperson statements and carefully managed social media activity suggesting a scheduled retreat and a period of strategic planning. But the people inside Vought who monitored his location at all times lost his signal on the morning after the basin, and it did not reappear for 11 days, and in those 11 days, a quiet terror moved through every level of the company. Because a located Homelander was a managed Homelander, and a managed Homelander was a predictable one, and a predictable one could be planned around. An unlocated Homelander was a different proposition entirely. He could be anywhere. He could be doing anything. He could be in a farmhouse in Iowa having a complete psychological collapse, or he could be 30,000 feet above a city making a decision that would require 17 press releases and a congressional appearance to contain. Nobody knew. And not knowing, with Homelander, was the specific variety of fear that kept the people who managed him from sleeping cleanly. He reappeared on a Tuesday, not through official channels. He simply appeared in the airspace above Washington, D.C. at 11 in the morning, visible to the naked eye, hovering at an altitude that was technically in restricted airspace, but practically beyond any enforcement mechanism the capital possessed. He stayed there for 4 hours. He did not attack anything. He did not speak to anyone. He did not broadcast, threaten, or perform. He simply hovered above the city in the gray autumn light, cape moving in the wind, and watched. And what made those 4 hours so profoundly disturbing, more disturbing than most of what Homelander had done in his documented history of disturbing actions, was the absence of audience direction in it. He was not hovering for the cameras, though the cameras were certainly there. He was not making a statement or delivering a message or managing a narrative. He was simply present above a city that feared him, and he was feeling something about that, and whatever he was feeling it privately. The city below watched him the way a body watches a fever, aware that something is happening inside a system, uncertain whether it is resolving or escalating, unable to do anything except wait and monitor and be afraid. Butcher did not hold a press conference. He did not give interviews. He did not appear on any platform to contextualize his presence in that Nevada basin or explain his intentions regarding the wish. What Butcher did, in the days and weeks after the basin, was continue exactly the work he had always done. Finding the places where the system was still killing people and applying pressure to those places with the focused, methodical, slightly exhausted energy of a man who had been doing this for so long that the question of whether it was working had long since become irrelevant to the doing of it. But something had changed in him, and the people closest to him could see it even if he would never have named it. The wish had not been his. The outcome had not been what he would have chosen. And yet, and this was the part that Butcher himself could not entirely look at directly, the outcome was not wrong. Compound 5 inert. No new Homelanders in production. The factory shut down even if the existing products remained on the floor. It was not annihilation. It was not the burning of everything he had decided needed to burn, but it was something. It was, in the specific accounting of a life spent measuring progress in fractions, more than he had ever actually achieved before. Starlight gave one interview. She chose her journalist carefully. Not the large, sent platform, not the most viewed outlet, not the venue that would have given the story the most immediate spectacle reach. She chose a journalist who had spent 15 years covering the human cost of soup incidents. People killed in collateral damage who were never counted in official reports. Families who had signed non-disclosure agreements as a condition of receiving compensation for the death of someone they loved. She gave the interview in a room with no Vought branding, wearing no costume under her own name, and in that interview, she said something that became the most replayed, most debated, most cited line of the entire Dragon Ball event. She was asked whether she believed she had made the right wish. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "I made the only wish I could make without becoming what I've been fighting." It was not a declaration of certainty. It was not a triumphant statement. It was the exhausted, precise, carefully chosen language of someone who had made an irreversible decision under impossible conditions and had decided that the only honest thing to do afterward was to hold it without flinching. The world received it the way the world receives honesty from public figures, with a mixture of admiration, suspicion, and the immediate impulse to debate whether she was telling the truth. The Dragon Balls had turned to stone and gone cold within minutes of Shenron's departure. They had scattered across the earth over the following days in ways that no tracking system could follow, carried by winds and waters, and the specific inexplicable physics of objects that operate on rules the world had never been designed to accommodate. They would sleep for a year, and then they would wake again, and they would glow again, and the world would know they were gettable again. And the world, which had just spent weeks revealing exactly what it was willing to do and become in pursuit of them, would have an entire year to sit with that knowledge, an entire year to look at what the hunt had cost. The bodies, the fractured institutions, the collapsed certainties, the new cults and new conspiracies and new wounds that would take decades to fully map. An entire year to ask whether the next time would be different. And the answer, visible in every press release and every adaptation and every rebranding and every quiet resumption of ordinary corruption that was already underway before the stone spheres had finished cooling. The answer was already being written. Not in words, in behavior. In the specific, familiar, entirely recognizable behavior of a world that had been shown something true about itself and had decided, efficiently and without excessive drama, to continue anyway. The cults did not dissolve when the Dragon Balls turned to stone. That was perhaps the most clarifying thing the aftermath revealed about the nature of belief in the boys' universe, that it did not require an active miracle to sustain itself. It only required the memory of one. Within 3 weeks of Shenron's departure, the 40-odd groups that had organized around Dragon Ball theology had not fragmented or disbanded or quietly redirected their energy towards something more practical. They had calcified, hardened into something more structured, more institutional, more deliberately self-perpetuating than the raw, desperate communities that had formed in the first days of the hunt. They had acquired property. They had developed internal hierarchies. They had begun producing content, sermons, manifestos, instructional materials on Dragon Ball location methodology, theological frameworks for understanding why the wish that had been made was either the fulfillment or the betrayal of divine intent, depending on which group you were asking. What had begun as human beings reaching toward a genuine miracle had become, with remarkable efficiency, another set of organizations competing for the loyalty of people who needed to believe in something larger than the system that was grinding them down. Vought watched the cults with professional interest and zero moral discomfort. The Narrative Architecture Group produced an internal assessment within 2 weeks of the Basin event that classified the new religious landscape not as a social crisis, but as an emerging market segment. The document, which would eventually be leaked and would produce its own cycle of outrage and congressional inquiry, used language that had been carefully developed to describe human spiritual need in the vocabulary of consumer behavior. It spoke of belief infrastructure, loyalty conversion rates, and narrative adjacency opportunities. It recommended a strategy of quiet proximity, Not direct involvement with any specific cult, which carried legal and reputational risk, but a sustained, low-visibility presence in the spaces around them. Sponsored content on platforms used by members. Infrastructure partnerships with venues hosting gatherings. Background data collection on the demographics of people most likely to be belief-activated by the Dragon Ball event, cross-referenced with existing VOT consumer profiles. The memo concluded with a single line that its author clearly believed was merely analytical, and that any reasonable human being reading it would understand immediately was the most devastating sentence in the document. This population is highly motivated, highly suggestible, and currently unmonetized. The congressional hearings began 6 weeks after the Basin. They were, by any measure, a masterpiece of institutional theater. Hours of carefully staged questioning in which politicians who had received VOT campaign contributions interrogated VOT executives who had been briefed by lawyers who had formerly worked for the same politicians, in a room watched by a public that had been thoroughly educated by 2 decades of VOT media product to associate congressional oversight with bureaucratic incompetence rather than genuine accountability. The hearings produced headlines, produced sound bites, produced the specific variety of performative outrage that the news cycle needed to justify continued coverage. They did not produce consequences. The closest they came was a moment in the 3rd day of testimony when a senator from a rural state, a woman who had lost a constituent to a soup-related incident 6 years earlier and had never received an adequate explanation from any official body, asked a VOT executive a question so direct and so plainly worded that the room went briefly, uncomfortably silent. She asked, "Did VOT know the Dragon Balls could grant wishes before the company publicly acknowledged their existence?" The executive consulted with his attorney for 45 seconds. Then he said that VOT had been aware of certain speculative assessments regarding the object's potential properties, the parameters of which had been actively under internal evaluation at the time of the public disclosure timeline. The senator stared at him for a long moment. Then she wrote something in her notebook. Nobody ever found out what it was. The question of Homelander remained the central unresolved problem of the post-Basin world in a way that Starlight's Wish had not actually addressed and that everyone who had been paying close attention had known it would not add. Res. Because Compound V being inert meant nothing to a man who had been made 40 years ago and was still operational. Homelander was unchanged, his power was unchanged, his psychology, cracked open in that Nevada basin and then sealed back over with the brutal efficiency of a man who had survived his entire life by refusing to remain open, was unchanged. What had changed, invisibly and perhaps permanently, was his relationship to the concept of limitation. He had believed, at the foundational level of his identity, that he was without limits, that nothing in the world exceeded him or preceded him or existed independently of his capacity to dominate it. Shenron had demonstrated, in the gentlest and most devastating possible way, that this belief was not true, and Homelander, who could survive bullets and lasers and falls from space, had no known defense against the specific damage of being forced to understand something true about himself that he had organized his entire existence around not knowing. The people nobody was discussing, the ones whose absence from the official narrative of the Dragon Ball event was itself a kind of data about the world's values, were the ordinary civilians who had suffered most directly during the hunt. The families displaced when Dragon Ball sightings turned their neighborhoods into operational zones. The people who had disappeared after claiming contact with the spheres and had not reappeared. The members of the smaller cults who had been financially exploited or psychologically manipulated or physically harmed by the rapid and ruthless internal hierarchies that desperation tends to produce. The sick people who had believed, with genuine and heartbreaking conviction, that Shenron was their last chance, and who woke up the morning after the wish to discover that the wish had not been theirs and that their situation was exactly what it had been before the dragon came, unchanged, except that now they also had to carry the knowledge that a miracle had existed and had been spent on something else. These people did not have press representatives. They did not appear in the VOT internal market segmentation documents except as data points. They did not testify at congressional hearings. They existed in the aftermath the way they had existed throughout, as the ground that the larger drama walked across, necessary for the story's geography and invisible to its protagonists. Frenchie built something in the months after the basin that nobody expected and that he himself could not entirely explain. He began collecting testimonies, not for any official purpose, not for legal proceedings or journalistic investigation or any organized effort with a stated goal. He simply began finding people who had been in the proximity of the Dragon Ball event, the displaced, the bereaved, the exploited, the merely frightened, and sitting with them and asking them to tell him what had happened to them. He recorded the conversations on a handheld device. He stored them on hard drives that he kept in a waterproof case under his bed. He did not know what he was going to do with them. Kimiko, who understood better than anyone the value and the cost of carrying stories that official histories refuse to hold, helped him without being asked. She would sit across from a witness while Frenchie recorded, and she would watch their face with the full, undivided, non-transactional attention that she had developed over years of being a person whose communication required other people to actually look at her. And the witnesses, almost without exception, said afterward that it was her attention, not Frenchie's questions, not the recording device, not any formal structure, that had made them feel, for the first time since everything happened, that they had actually been seen. Huey spent the weeks after the basin in a state that was not quite depression, and not quite relief, and not quite the particular species of survivor's disorientation that follows a crisis you were in the middle of and then were not. He went through the ordinary motions of his days with the specific, deliberate attention of someone who has recently been reminded that ordinary days are not guaranteed. He called his father more than he had in years. He slept regular hours. He cooked badly, with the focused incompetence of someone doing a new thing on purpose because the old things carried too much weight for a while. And in the quiet spaces of those ordinary days, he thought about the wish, not about whether it was right. He had settled into a tentative, uncomfortable acceptance of Starlight's choice that he suspected would periodically destabilize and need to be resettled for the rest of his life. He thought about the 43 seconds, about the fact that the window for an entirely different world, a world where Homelander had gotten his wish or Butcher had gotten his, or no wish had been made at all, had been 43 seconds wide. He thought about how many times in his life the difference between the world that happened and all the worlds that didn't had been measured in seconds. And he thought about what you do with a life in a world that is this close to being a completely different one, all the time, continuously, without ever quite resolving into either catastrophe or grace. He did not reach a conclusion, but he kept thinking, which was, in the accounting of a universe like this one, not nothing. The Dragon Balls slept in their stone form across 7 locations on Earth that no human technology could identify or track. They would wake in a year. Everyone knew they would wake in a year. And the world, which had just demonstrated with extraordinary thoroughness exactly what it was willing to do when the possibility of a wish became real, spent those months building to ward the next time with the focused, unconscious efficiency of a system that does not require anyone to consciously plan its worst outcomes. The cults grew, the black markets adapted, the military programs that had been classified during the crisis remained classified and continued operating under new mandates. Vought filed 14 new patents related to enhanced individual capability assessment that contained no direct reference to Dragon Balls and were entirely consistent with a company that had learned from recent events and was positioning itself for a future it had already modeled in considerable detail. The world was not healing. The world was not destroyed. The world was doing what it had always done, what it had been designed to do, what every system in it had been optimized to perpetuate. It was continuing, and in the gap between continuing and actually changing, in that specific and enormous distance, the next year was already being written, not in the language of miracles, but in the language the world had always been most fluent in, the language of appetite, the language of accumulation, the language of a civilization that had been shown once what it truly was and had decided that the showing was something it could survive and move past and ultimately, efficiently, fold into the ongoing project of being exactly what it had always been. A year is a long time in a world moving at the speed of the boys' universe. Long enough for a war to start and be rebranded as a peacekeeping operation. Long enough for a congressional inquiry to exhaust itself into irrelevance. Long enough for the public to absorb a civilization-scale event, metabolize it into content, argue about it until the argument felt more real than the event itself, and then file it in the psychological category reserved for things that happened and changed everything, and also somehow changed nothing. The Dragon Ball year, as it came to be called, in the flattening shorthand that major historical events always eventually receive, was not a year of quiet reflection. It was not a year of reckoning or rebuilding or any of the other words that get applied to post-crisis periods by people who prefer their history to have a discernible arc. It was a year of adaptation, which is what systems do when they cannot be destroyed and cannot be transformed. They adapt, they absorb the new information, they incorporate it into their existing logic. They continue. The superhero landscape after the Wish looked, on its surface, remarkably similar to what it had looked like before. The Seven still existed, reduced in membership but not in brand presence. Vought had discovered through careful internal testing that a smaller roster of soups actually increased individual hero visibility and therefore individual hero monetization potential, which meant the reduction was repackaged as a strategic refinement rather than a loss. Heroes who had previously been in the Vought system without making compound V-based enhancements remained operational and were promoted into newly prominent positions with language about authenticity and natural excellence. A secondary tier of heroes, those whose powers were less dramatic but whose compliance records were excellent, was elevated and given increased screen time in the relaunched American Hero format. The show's ratings for its new season exceeded the previous record by 31%, which the Narrative Architecture Group correctly identified as evidence that the public's appetite for the performance of heroism had not diminished. If anything, the Dragon Ball event had intensified it. People who had seen genuine, undeniable, ancient power operate outside human control for 3 weeks had come back to manufactured, corporate, carefully managed heroism with the specific relief of returning to something familiar after an encounter with something real. The power dynamics between existing soups shifted in ways that were slow and complex and not immediately visible from the outside. Homelander remained at the top of the formal hierarchy by institutional inertia and the simple physics of his being the most dangerous thing in the system, and therefore the thing the system most needed to keep nominally satisfied. But something had changed in the way other soups related to him, and the change was not easily named. It was not reduced fear. The fear was intact, structurally, because the reasons for it were intact. It was something more like a shift in the quality of the submission. Before the Basin, soups who deferred to Homelander did so with the total, unexamined submission of people who had never seen him encounter a limit. After the Basin, the submission had a layer of consciousness to it. A thin, almost invisible awareness, present in the half-second before compliance, that Homelander had stood before something greater than himself and had asked it for love and had not received an answer he could use. Nobody spoke about this awareness. It existed in the same way that many true things exist in that universe, acknowledged by everyone and named by no one, folded into behavior without ever being articulated, shaping the room without ever appearing in any transcript. The boys continued operating. This was not a surprise to anyone who knew them, but it required a recalibration that none of them had anticipated needing. Because the boys had always been defined by their opposition, by the specific clarifying force of having a target. Compound Phi was not the target exactly, but it was the mechanism, the factory, the production logic of everything the target represented. With Compound 5 inert, the architecture of opposition required adjustment. The existing soups were still there. The system that had produced and weaponized Hem was still there. Vought was still there, adapting at its usual frightening speed. The work was the same work, but the frame around it had shifted in the way that a picture shifts when the wall it hangs on is moved. The image unchanged, the context subtly but permanently different. Butcher adapted by doing what Butcher always did when confronted with complexity he could not simplify through force. He narrowed his focus to the immediately actionable and declined to examine the rest. Huey adapted by continuing to think about the 43 seconds. Starlight adapted by doing the interview and then doing more interviews. and then doing something she had not done since before she understood what Vought was. She began speaking in public not as a brand, not as a hero, not as a Vought asset, but as herself, as Annie January, as a woman who had been inside the machine and had chosen, at a cost she was still calculating, to work against it. The theological landscape of the Dragon Ball year was simultaneously the most intellectually interesting and the most practically dangerous development of the aftermath period. Because Shenron's existence had done something to the spiritual fabric of the boys' universe that could not be undone by the dragon's departure or the wish's completion or any subsequent official statement from any religious institution. It had introduced irrefutable empirical evidence of the existence of a being that operated on principles entirely outside the categories of either conventional religion or conventional science. Every established faith tradition had to decide what to do with that evidence, and the decisions being made across traditions were varied and, in several cases, catastrophic for institutional stability. Some traditions attempted integration, developing theological frameworks in which Shenron was accommodated within existing doctrinal structures as a divine instrument, a test, a messenger. Some attempted rejection, doubling down on the position that the Dragon Ball phenomenon had been a mass delusion or a sophisticated technological deception, a position that became harder to maintain with each passing month of documented physical evidence, but that served important institutional purposes and therefore continued to be advanced regardless. And some, the most dangerous, the fastest growing, the ones that the Vought market segmentation documents had correctly identified as unmonetized opportunities, attempted replacement. Building entirely new theological systems with Shenron at their center, systems that had no legacy institutional baggage, no historic compromise, no centuries of accommodation with existing power structures. Systems designed from the ground up around a god who was real, who granted wishes, who operated on comprehensible rules, and who would return. The anticipation of that return was the defining psychological fact of the Dragon Ball year. Everyone knew the spheres would wake. Everyone was preparing. The difference between the factions preparing was not in the intensity of preparation. That was roughly equal across Vought, the governments, the military black ops programs, the cults, the criminal organizations, and the growing international coalition that Starlight had begun quietly assembling around the principle that wish access should not belong to any single entity. The difference was in what each faction believed the preparation was for. Vought believed it was preparing for an acquisition. The military programs believed they were preparing for a strategic asset seizure. The cults believed they were preparing for a divine appointment. The criminal organizations believed they were preparing for the largest single-transaction black market event in human history. Starlight's coalition believed it was preparing for a negotiation, a genuine, structured, internationally supervised process for determining how a wish, if made, should be made. And Butcher, who was aware of all of these preparations and was conducting his own in parallel with the specific self-contained efficiency of a man who had stopped trusting any coalition the moment it required him to explain himself to people who had not lost what he had lost, believed he was preparing for a correction, a second chance at the thing that had been 43 seconds from his hands and had been taken from him by a woman whose judgment he respected and whose choice he could not entirely forgive. What none of the factions, in their varying sophistication and desperation and institutional might, had adequately prepared for was the possibility that the Dragon Ball's second waking might not look like the first. Because Shenron's rules, as they had been understood from the Dragon Ball mythology, allowed for one set of wishes per summoning cycle before the spheres went dormant. But those rules had been understood in a different universe, by beings operating in a different moral context, under conditions that bore little resemblance to the specific, peculiar, comprehensively corrupted environment they had just spent a year navigating. And there were people, theorists, scholars, members of the new theological traditions who had spent the entire Dragon Ball year in serious study of everything that was known about the spheres, who were quietly, carefully raising a question that nobody in any official faction wanted to hear. The question was whether Shenron, having observed what this universe had done with the hunt and the wish and the aftermath, would come back the same way. Whether the dragon that returned might be the same ancient force operating on the same ancient rules, or whether something that had existed long enough and across enough universes to Have preferences might arrive for the second summoning, having formed in the year of stone and sleep a view about the world it was returning to. Not a judgment exactly, not a punishment. Just a view. The way any sufficiently old and sufficiently attentive thing eventually develops a view about the particular quality of the darkness it is being asked to illuminate. The year ended on a Tuesday. Ordinary Tuesday. No significant weather, no particular news event that would later be remembered as contextually meaningful. Somewhere in the Mariana Trench, a stone sphere the size of a grapefruit began, very slowly, to warm. 4 stars appeared on its surface, faint at first, then unmistakable. The specific orange glow that the world had spent a year trying to forget it recognized. 11 minutes later, a deep-sea monitoring system operated by an institution with no public name and no official existence registered the thermal signature and transmitted an encrypted alert to 17 recipients in 7 countries. The recipients, each of whom had spent a year preparing for exactly this notification, began making calls. The calls triggered protocols. The protocols activated infrastructure. And the world, which had learned nothing and forgotten nothing and changed in all the wrong ways and none of the right ones, began to move again toward the thing it could not resist and could not survive and could not stop reaching for. The second hunt had begun, and this time everyone already knew what it cost. There is a specific kind of horror that has no name in any language because every civilization that has encountered it has preferred by instinct not to develop the vocabulary for it. It is the horror of recognition, not the recognition of a monster or a threat or an enemy. Those have names. Those can be pointed at and labeled and placed outside the self where they can be properly feared. This is the recognition of something interior, something that was always there. Structural and load-bearing, present in every decision the civilization ever made. Visible in retrospect in every choice that was dressed in the language of necessity or protection or justice, but that was, beneath that language, something simpler and harder to look at. The Dragon Ball event did not introduce this horror to the boys' universe. It did not create it or import it or manufacture it for dramatic effect. It simply removed, for a period of weeks, the mechanisms that the world had developed for not having to see it. And then it left. And the mechanisms were rebuilt, and the horror went back to being the foundation rather than the subject. Present everywhere, named nowhere, sustaining everything. The second summoning occurred not in a desert or a basin or a remote military installation. It occurred in the parking lot of a Costco in Akron, Ohio at 2:17 in the afternoon on a Wednesday because the 7th Dragon Ball had been quietly held for 11 months by a retired schoolteacher named Margaret Chen, who had found it in her backyard garden the previous spring and had not told anyone, not because she was calculating or strategic or affiliated with any of the factions spending billions of dollars trying to locate it, but because she was 71 years old and had developed over 7 decades of watching the world operate a profound and evidence-based distrust of what happened to valuable things once powerful people learned they existed. She had kept it in a shoebox under her bed. She had thought about it every night. She had made a decision about what she would wish for if the decision were hers to make, and the decision had not changed in 11 months, and she had carried it with the quiet certainty of a person who has had a long time to know their own mind. She drove herself to the Costco because it had the largest parking lot she could think of. She arranged the Dragon Balls. She had contacted, through a method she declined to explain to anyone afterward, representatives of 6 of the 7 factions, and arranged for their spheres to be present, in the configuration she had researched. And she summoned Shenron in the parking lot of a Costco in Akron, Ohio, on a Wednesday afternoon, while 3 news helicopters and 47 military vehicles and an unknown number of covert operatives from 6 separate intelligence agencies and approximately 900 civilians who had been tracking the sphere convergence on social media watched from varying distances. Shenron came differently the second time. Everyone who was present for both summonings, and there were several, including Starlight, including Butcher, including 2 Vought executives who had tracked Margaret Chen for 3 weeks before losing her again, said the same thing when asked to describe the difference. They said that the first time, Shenron had arrived with the indifferent weight of something ancient and external, something that was here because the rules said it was here, present without preference, available without opinion. The second time, he arrived with attention, specific, directed, considered attention. The emerald light was the same. The scale was the same. The impossible pressure of genuine divinity occupying physical space was the same. But the quality of his gaze as he settled above the Costco parking lot and looked down at the collection of factions that had assembled there, at Homelander hovering 20 feet off the ground with an expression nobody could read, at Butcher standing with his arms at his sides and his jaw set, at Starlight beside Margaret Chen with one hand raised in a gesture that was half protection and half surrender, at the military vehicles and the news helicopters and the 900 civilians filming on their phones and the Vought executives in the rented SUVs at the perimeter, the quality of that gaze was different. It was the gaze of something that had, in the year of stone and sleep, formed a view. Margaret Chen spoke before anyone else could. This was not because she was the bravest person in that parking lot, though she may have been. It was because she had decided 11 months earlier that if this moment came, she would not hesitate. That hesitation was the mechanism by which the world's worst decisions got made, the half-second of uncertainty in which someone else's agenda filled the vacuum. She looked up at Shenron, and she said her wish in a clear voice without preamble or performance or any of the rhetorical architecture that every other faction had spent months constructing. She said, "I wish that every person on Earth could see, for 1 minute, the full consequences of every choice being made in their name. Not wealth, not power, not the reversal of any specific tragedy or the elimination of any specific threat, not the thing that Homelander had asked for, or the thing that Butcher had wanted, or the thing that Vought had planned for, or the thing that any government or cult or criminal organization had positioned itself to seize. 1 minute. Full consequences. For everyone." The silence after the wish lasted 4 seconds. Then Shenron spoke, and his voice, which had the quality of something that had been translated through too many languages and too many centuries to retain the texture of any single one, said one word. "Done." And the world stopped. Not physically. The helicopters kept turning. The phones kept recording. The wind kept moving across the parking lot. But something stopped. Something interior and simultaneous and entirely without precedent in the document, history of human consciousness. For 60 seconds, every person on Earth experienced a complete, unmediated, undeniable understanding of the full consequence of every choice being made in their name, by their governments, by their corporations, by their institutions, by the systems they participated in and sustained and benefited from and preferred not to examine too closely. Every person, simultaneously, for 60 seconds. Nobody has ever been able to adequately describe what those 60 seconds were like, because the experience was different for every person who lived it, and because the honest description of it, for most people, required a vocabulary of self-confrontation that the world's languages have been carefully evolved to make difficult to access. What can be said is that in those 60 seconds there was no noise, not imposed silence. People could make noise if they chose to, could speak, could scream, could do anything physically available to them. But nobody did, because what was moving through them was too large and too specific and too personal to be processed through any behavior that a body could perform in 60 seconds. Homelander was silent. Butcher was silent. The Vought executives were silent. The 900 civilians were silent. The soldiers in the military vehicles were silent. Somewhere in Washington, D.C., in a secure facility that had been monitoring the Akron situation through 17 separate channels, a room full of intelligence professionals was silent. For 60 seconds, the world looked at itself without the filters it had spent centuries building, and what it saw was not a surprise. That was the most devastating part. What it saw was not new information. It was simply information it had always had, delivered without the ability to look away. Shenron was gone before the 60 seconds ended. Margaret Chen had asked for a minute, and the dragon, with the specifics, precision of a force that takes stated terms seriously, had granted exactly a minute and departed without waiting to observe what the minute produced. The Dragon Balls turned to stone where they sat on the parking lot asphalt, 7 gray spheres cooling in the Ohio afternoon, surrounded by 900 people and 47 military vehicles and 3 news helicopters and every apparatus of surveillance and power that the world had scrambled to position for this moment. And all of it, all the preparation and the positioning and the colossal institutional weight of everything the world had spent a year constructing to control this outcome, all of it was simply present with the people inside it, in the silence, in the 60 seconds, in the full, unmediated weight of consequence, without the mercy of interpretation. What happened after the 60 seconds is still being sorted out. It will be sorted out for a long time. There were resignations, some of them immediate, some of them delayed by weeks of internal deliberation that people would later describe as the most difficult weeks of their lives. There were decisions made quietly and privately and without press conferences that nonetheless rippled outward into the public world in ways that would take years to fully trace. There were people who did nothing. More people than the optimistic accounts would later want to acknowledge. People who had the same 60 seconds as everyone else and who emerged from them and looked at the world exactly as it was and made, in the privacy of their own unobserved interior, the decision to continue as before. Not because they were uniquely monstrous, but because the distance between understanding consequence and changing behavior had always been the fundamental problem of the human species, and 60 seconds of clarity, however total, had not bridged it. What the 60 seconds had done, what Margaret Chen's wish had accomplished with the specific, modest, revolutionary ambition of a retired schoolteacher who had thought carefully about what was actually possible, was remove the defense of ignorance, permanently. For everyone. Homelander did not resign, and he did not change, and he did not disappear, and he did not become something other than what he was. He landed in the Costco parking lot when the 60 seconds ended, and he stood among the stone Dragon Balls, and he looked at Margaret Chen for a long time. She looked back. She was not afraid, or if she was afraid, she had made the same decision about fear that she had made about hesitation, that it was not a reason. He did not speak to her. He looked at her for approximately 20 seconds, which was long enough for every news helicopter to get footage and every operator to confirm the scene was not escalating and Butcher to move his hand away from whatever he had been reaching for. Then Homelander looked up at the sky where Shenron had been. Then he flew away, straight up, without a word, without a broadcast, without a statement or a threat or any of the machinery of a man performing himself for an audience. He simply left, and everyone who watched him go understood that something had shifted, but nobody could say toward what, and nobody could say whether the shift was toward something better or simply toward something different and equally dangerous in ways that had not yet declared themselves. The sky closed over where he had been. The ordinary afternoon continued, and the world, which had now been shown itself twice, completely, without the option of not seeing, went back to the work of deciding, one private choice at a time, what to do with what it knew. Billy Butcher stood in the parking lot for a long time after everyone else had left. He stood among the stone spheres until the news helicopters moved on, and the military vehicles pulled out, and the 900 civilians drifted back to wherever 900 civilians go after witnessing something that does not fit into any existing category of experience. He stood there until it was just him and the gray spheres and the Ohio sky going orange at the edges, and Margaret Chen, who had not left either, who was sitting on the hood of her car eating a sandwich from the Costco food court with the composed practicality of a woman who has done what she came to do and has no remaining agenda. Butcher looked at her for a while. Then he said, "That wasn't what I would have wished for." And she said, without looking up from her sandwich, "I know." And he said, "It won't be enough." And she said, "Probably not." He nodded. He looked at the stone spheres one more time, at the 7 gray, cooling, ordinary-looking objects that had briefly been the most contested things on Earth and were now just rocks in a parking lot in Ohio. Then he walked to his car. He did not look back. The spheres would sleep for a year. Then they would wake again, and the world that had twice been shown itself completely would have to decide, once more, whether it was capable of making a different choice. Whether knowledge, without the mercy of ignorance, was enough to change the calculus. Whether a civilization that had looked at itself without filters and continued anyway had any claim left on the concept of hope. The answer, Billy Butcher had decided somewhere in the Nevada basin a year ago and had not changed his mind about since, was probably no. But probably no had never stopped anyone in this universe from trying. And trying, in a world this dark, in a universe this thoroughly designed to consume everything decent that entered it, trying, even without hope, even without the dragon, even with full knowledge of the consequence and no remaining excuse for pretending otherwise, was the only thing left that was not for sale. The spheres slept, the world continued, and somewhere in the distance, in the specific and permanent dark of a universe that had been given every chance and had made its nature comprehensively clear, something ancient and patient and entirely beyond the reach of any corporate rebranding campaign simply waited for the next time someone was desperate enough or brave enough or foolish enough to gather 7 small stones and ask the sky for one more miracle it had not yet earned. And that is the truth that Shenron revealed. Not about dragons, not about wishes, not about who is strongest or who deserves to win. The truth about what a civilization actually is, when everything that lets it lie to itself is stripped away for 60 seconds in a parking lot in Ohio. So here is the question I will leave with you. If you had been there, if you had those 60 seconds and felt the full weight of every choice made in your name, would you have walked back to your car, or would you have stayed? Let me know in the comments. If you want more stories that ask the questions nobody else is willing to ask, subscribe, because in this universe, the next hunt has already begun. And next time, the dragon might not be so patient.